try to convey to you some useful observations I have collected over my professional life, representing a variety of foreign investors in Brazil. I have been practicing law for longer than I would like to admit, and I have, I think, a lot of experience representing foreign companies. I started my career with Baker & McKenzie. I opened their office in Rio de Janeiro in 1972 and ran that office for 25 years. And about 14 years ago, we decided that it was time to leave Baker & McKenzie and start our own firm. And we have been very successful in Rio, São Paulo, and in 3 other cities in Brazil: Porto Alegre, Brasília, and a small town in the interior of São Paulo where we devote our attention to the agribusiness. I have addressed audiences like this for many, many years. And it's funny to realize that in the past, I was always trying to justify why Brazil did not work, why we had chronic inflation, why we had political instability, why we had so many problems. Brazil was considered the country of the future. And as far as I am concerned, I thought the future would never come around. I never thought in my lifetime I would see the future come to Brazil. But all of a sudden, the future has arrived. And I'm very pleased to be talking to you and bringing good news. It's interesting. Nowadays, I go to events in America, in Europe, in Asia, and sometimes I am accompanied by people of other countries, countries that are considered developed countries. But the only bearer of good news is the old Brazilian. And this is a very salutary change, and I'm very happy. Brazil has finally emerged as a country that is no longer a developing country, but a country that is developed and has, as the ambassador mentioned, acquired political stability, control of inflation, and offers tremendous opportunities for investment. Last year, Brazil attracted approximately $50 billion in foreign investment. And this year, as of the 1st of April, we had attracted already $35 billion, which is a remarkable amount of money under any circumstances. In my presentations around the world, I'm asked often, why and how is it doing business in Brazil? Is it better or worse than doing business anyplace else? And my invariable answer is that it's neither better nor worse. It's different. And the sooner you understand the differences, the better off you're going to be. We have a lot of cultural differences, and the sooner you understand these differences, the happier and the more successful you're going to be in Brazil. Brazil, as you know, was colonized by the Portuguese, and we inherited from our Portuguese forefathers a lot of good things and a lot of bad things. One of the good things is, as opposed to Spanish America, the Portuguese were able to maintain political unity over a country that is of continental dimensions, unity of language, unity of religion, and political unity. On the other hand, we inherited some bad things, and some of these bad things are translated into bureaucracy. And we Brazilians have taken bureaucracy to a very successful stage. I think that there is only one country in the world, perhaps India, that has a bureaucracy bigger than Brazil. As a result, Brazil is not considered an easy jurisdiction to do business. It's complicated. It has a variety of laws, regulations, and rules that make at times life very frustrating, particularly for those like yourselves that come from a society that is extremely efficient, is extremely geared towards results. I remember being here in Singapore about 8 months ago, and I was talking, and I met for the first time the CFO for Petrobras, and I asked him who he was using as a lawyer. He said, well, we have been doing business in Singapore for many years, and we don't use lawyers. We don't need lawyers. I was able to form the company myself without the recourse to lawyers. Well, this is impossible in Brazil, ladies and gentlemen. It does not mean that this is bad or worse. It's different. So the first thing you learn when you do business in Brazil is that you need a lot of patience and a lot of perseverance. But Brazilians, as the ambassador has said, are very creative. And we have found a way of doing or dealing with bureaucracy. And this is a Brazilian jeito. The word jeito is spelled J-E-I-T-O. And the jeito does not necessarily mean that you're using illegal or bribery to get your way around. Jeito means a very creative and sophisticated way of getting around problems and solving life's difficulties on a day-to-day basis. Jeito, as I said, does not imply illegality. Professor Keith Rosen from the University of Miami wrote a very witty and interesting article about the jeito. And it was so successful that he wrote a second article, The Jeito Revisited. And I will give you a small example of what I mean by jeito. A few years ago, we were representing a company that was drilling for oil offshore the state of Bahia. And just about the eve of Carnival, the captain of the port of Salvador impounded one of the supply boats that was supplying materials, food, and so forth to the platform that was operating offshore. And the client desperately calls me on a Thursday evening saying, my supply boat has been apprehended, and this will mean that all during the Carnival week we won't be able to operate. What do you suggest as a lawyer? And I said, sir, you have two alternatives. One is the legal alternative. We can file a writ of mandamus, and I can assure you that by tomorrow morning I will have a court order releasing that boat for operation. But as a lawyer, I would not recommend that advice. And he said, why? He said, because you are going to get an enemy for life on that port captain, and your life is going to be made miserable. So what is the alternative? It's the jeito. I said, give me an opportunity to find out who the boss to this port captain is, probably an admiral here in Rio de Janeiro, whom I don't know, but I will try to find out who he is, and I will meet with him, and I'll try to convince him to call his subordinate and explain to him the reasons why he was not right in apprehending the boat. The boat was apprehended because this port captain had understood that the boat did not have a majority of a Brazilian crew, which he would have been right if the boat had been a Brazilian flag boat. But this boat happened to be a foreign flag boat authorized to operate under Brazilian waters, and therefore his decision was wrong. So, to make a long story short, I went to see the admiral, talked to him, and I said, for God's sake, don't berate your subordinate. Just tell him and try to convince him that he made a mistake, because I want to be in good terms with this man. We have to be in good terms with this man because we're going to be in Salvador for many, many months. And that was the way we solved that problem. Now, although Brazil has a very sophisticated and well-trained business class, which is up to par with any of the foreign business administrators around the world, you should be aware that Brazilians in general do not like to say no. We have an aversion to being negative. We think it's impolite. We beat around the bush to the extent that we expect you to understand that we are not in agreement with what you're saying. Another point which I think you should bear in mind is that in negotiations, what is not said at times is more important than what it is said. Learning what is in between lines is very important. And if you're going to negotiate contracts in Brazil, you better understand and master this technique. Do not be surprised if people change their minds in the middle of negotiations. Sometimes in protracted negotiations you go step by step. And sometimes you think that things have been settled and have been agreed upon, but all of a sudden you find that Brazilians have changed their minds. We don't have the culture of having a commitment until the agreement is signed. Time is a very flexible thing in Brazil. The Portuguese have a fantastic idea for this. They never tell you that an appointment is at 8 o'clock or is at 8:30 or at 9 o'clock. They always say around 9 o'clock, around 8:30. And Brazilians have copied this and again perfected the art. Know who is more important sometimes than know how. And this is where it's very important to develop this kind of rapport that the ambassador was referring to. Again, I will cite another example. We had a company that was drilling for oil in the mouth of the Amazon, and one of the legs of the platform broke out. And the big issue was who was responsible. My client said, well, it's Petrobras that is responsible because they provided us with the wrong information about the sea bottom, and we placed the platform in place, and it was the wrong place, and that's why the platform broke. And Petrobras, of course, said, no, it's not our fault, it was your responsibility. And this thing ensued for a long time. One day the client walks into my office and said, I want to sue Petrobras. I said, oh my God, I'm going to be in trouble. And I said, well, if you are the client, if you want to sue Petrobras, I will eventually have to do that. But again, give me an opportunity to talk to the General Counsel for Petrobras. I am almost willing to bet that he's not aware of this problem. And I happen to have a good professional relationship with this gentleman. So I picked up the phone, explained to him what the problem was, and sure enough, he was not aware of the problem. He asked me to send him the information that I had on the dispute, and in about a week's time we were sitting around the table and negotiating a settlement. Again, know who is very, very important. It may sound self-serving, but you cannot do business in Brazil without a lawyer by your side. And if you don't like the lawyer that is addressing you, there are plenty of lawyers in Brazil that are very good and very capable. And if you don't like the Brazilian lawyers, now we have more than 40 foreign firms licensed to do business in Brazil. They cannot practice yet local law. In my opinion, eventually they will, but for the time being they cannot. But they can give you general advice about doing business in Brazil. But it is a jurisdiction where it pays to be well assisted. If you are going to go into partnership, please take the time to investigate the partner. Don't fall into the temptation of going to bed with the first person that you meet. It's very important to investigate the background of your partners. Like any other place in the world, Brazil has a fair share of crooks. And these crooks are usually very well presented, very sophisticated, and very seductive. And many times we have seen clients impressed because the gentleman or the lady speaks very good English, appears to have the right context, and they jump into a conclusion and sign an agreement. Talk to the other Singaporean companies that are operating in Brazil. Talk to IE Singapore. Talk to your lawyers. Talk to your bankers. The business community in Brazil is not that big. You can always find somebody that will know the person that you're doing business with. And it pays to take this time. If you follow the above tips, I think that if you have the right product or sell the right services, you can be extremely successful in Brazil. There are many opportunities, as Ambassador Paulo Soares has pointed out. We are in a very good period in our life. There are these events that are coming up, like the World Cup and the Olympics, that will offer many opportunities for companies that are looking for opportunities to do business in Brazil. And I think it can be fun, and it can be also very attractive to do business there. Again, as Ambassador has pointed out, Brazilians are welcoming foreigners. They enjoy this sort of relationship that leads into friendships out of initial business contacts. And you'll think that despite all these difficulties, once you understand the cultural differences, once you understand the local scene, it can be fun, you can make money, and you can have a very good time in Brazil. Thank you very much.